This story occurred back in October, and I'm still shook by this. I live just outside of Red Deer, Alberta, Canada. It takes about 10 minutes to drive from where I live to the city of Red Deer. So my best friend, who I'll call Katie, and her boyfriend, who I'll call Josh, invited me for Thanksgiving dinner. In Canada, we celebrate Thanksgiving in October, so I drove about 20 minutes from my house to hers and spent the night. We had our dinner and some wine and some laughs. I spent the night, since I was drinking wine that night. I slept in the guest bed while they slept in the basement with their 2 dogs, Emmett and Arlo. It was around 4 a.m. I woke up randomly, which was normal. I always wake up randomly in the middle of the night. Except this specific time, I woke up and instantly felt a sense of dread. My back was facing the door, which I left a crack open that night, so it wasn't closed all the way. I just hid there for a minute, not being able to shake off that uneasy vibe that I had. And something inside of me was telling me not to roll over and look. I wanted to know why I was feeling this gut instinct, but something inside me said that it was a bad idea. So, I just stayed in the same position for a couple more minutes to see if the feeling would subside. But it didn't. Then, I heard the dogs, Emmett and Arlo, weeping. Feeling concerned, I decided with all my courage to roll over and look at the door. What I saw in the doorway to my room, I nearly shit myself. I looked, and there was my best friend, Katie, standing at my doorway, just staring at me, watching me. I just about had a heart attack. She was just standing there, staring at me, with her eyes wide open. She had a straight face at first when I saw her. I then asked, "Katie, what are you doing?" Well, that straight, wide-eyed facial expression turned into a blood-curdling grin. Her eyes remained open, extremely wide. When I saw that, I said, "Katie, what is it? Why aren't you in bed?" She then backed away from my door, still having that terrifying grin on her face, and disappeared into the darkness. A few seconds after that, I got up to investigate what the hell that was. I came out of the room I was staying in, and I looked. Katie wasn't upstairs. I even looked out the glass sliding door in her kitchen to see if she might have let her dogs out. Nope. No Katie. I crept downstairs very quietly and peeked into her room. I looked, and there was Katie and Josh, sound asleep in their bed. There was no way Katie had left my room and went all the way back downstairs that quickly, without me hearing her go downstairs. Did I just encounter my best friend's doppelganger? I couldn't just leave and drive all the way back home without telling them that I left. I've never seen my bubbly and happy Katie look so cold and evil. I swear that was not her. I don't want to tell her or Josh, fearing that I would freak them out or think that I'm crazy. I'm still absolutely shocked over this. I know this wasn't a dream. I'm starting to wonder if some unwanted evil entity took the shape of Katie's body and tried to lure me into something insidious. I did ask Katie one thing that following morning. Does she sleepwalk? She told me never once in her life. To prelude, I was a 5'3", 23-year-old girl at the time attending university for an art degree. Right off the bat, you can assume I was a little bit nerdy, and yes, I am. This event happened October 2017, during my junior year of college. I remember it was a windy night in town making skateboarding to my next class a hassle. I figured that walking would be my best option to get to class on time, because otherwise, I would be late due to a low drag on my board. So I get off my board and start my short trek to class. It was nice fall weather outside for the time of night, and it was sort of populated, so it was safe to say that I felt at ease about walking alone. Class was about another 10-minute walk. For this reason, I decided to pop my headphones in and enjoy the next 10 minutes of my journey. All was well, and I felt unusually happy because, let's face it, late night classes aren't always the best. They actually sucked a lot now that I think about it, though it was alright because perfect conditions called for happy times, and I wasn't gonna let class ruin the vibe. Soon that would all change. I continued walking to class, turning a corner, and strolled the last 5 minutes down the pavement. At that moment is when I noticed that there wasn't anyone walking about anymore. You know, as humans, we have a natural instinct to feel a threat or feel if we are in danger. That indeed was what I felt walking that short distance to class. It was then that the fight or flight kicked in like a light switch, even though I didn't know for sure if I was in any real danger. Was I in danger, or was someone else in danger? I didn't know, and because I didn't know, it made trusting my instincts a whole lot worse. The building my class resided in was in eye distance, and I knew for sure that if I was actually being pursued, I had to make it to that door. So, cautiously, I continued walking, hoping to make it to class unharmed. I eagerly wanted to know for sure if I was being followed or watched, but 3 factors urged me not to investigate. The first was my headphones. I knew taking my headphones out would open up some more human sense to attempt figuring out if my senses were true. However, taking out my headphones risked having the person know that I'm onto them, and that is the last thing that I needed. Factor number 2 was my sense of sight. I could not see anything besides what was illuminated in front of me by light posts. I know you must be thinking, why didn't you just turn around and sneak a peek? Well, you see, it's not that simple, as turning around would again reveal that I'm aware of the pursuer. So that definitely was not the smartest option. Lastly, my gut told me to just get to the door and I will be scot-free. Although trusting my gut made the situation that more of a reality, I realized my only way of survival at this point was to make it to that dumb door. Feet away from the door, I got the urge to make a dash to ensure that I would be safe. At this point, it was now or never, and I chose now. I made a mad dash to the silver door to the building, grabbing the handle and ripping the door open, slamming it behind me and locking it from the inside. I felt safe and secure now that I'm inside, and I now feel safe enough to see if my suspicions were correct, only to be greeted with a pavement way full of nothingness. Full of confusion and adrenaline, I stood there defeated and a tad disappointed. I felt so sure that my senses were true, but I guess I put too much faith on a whim. Nonetheless, I ended up making it to class barely on time to catch the first lecture. It was difficult to concentrate, especially after a false alarm my body decided to hit me with. It was my last class of the day anyway, so I eventually brushed off my jitters and tried my best to pay attention for the rest of the lecture. An hour later, the lecture began to die down, and class was nearly over. I began packing up my belongings, excited to get home and sleep, until a guy tapped me on the shoulder, asking if I was okay. Confused, I said yes, and asked why. What he explained to me next made my heart skip a beat. The guy in my class told me that he was also trying to make it to class on time, around the same 10 minutes that I had to walk to get to class. He explained that he saw me as well, and ended up rounding the same corner that I did. Immediately, I knew he was possibly following behind me, which made me feel the way I did earlier, so I asked him why he followed so close. He grew a confused look on his face, which also confused me. He said he wasn't close to me at all. In fact, he made it clear to me that he was about a half a block behind me. This sent chills down my neck and propelled me to ask the number one question in my head at the time. Did he see anyone else behind me? His face turned pale when he registered what was unfolding. He said yes, and continued telling me the person following me was practically within arm's reach of me, and he assumed the person was a friend or something. Like a car crash, my mind hit me with a mix of emotions, of confusion and fear. Everything made sense, besides one small detail. When I looked out the door to see if anyone was there, I saw no one at all. I asked him if he saw me running, and confidently he said yes. I then asked if he saw the other person run as well, and again, with utter confidence, he said yes. Now I'm just downright scared out of my mind and don't really know what to think. Regardless, I pulled it together to ask the only question left for me to ask the guy in my class. Where in the world did the guy go when I looked and didn't see him out the door? He hesitantly told me, before I got to the door, the person broke off and went in a completely different direction, for which I'm assuming to not get caught. More emotions and thoughts began to run through my mind. The feeling of being watched and followed were true, causing me to go into a visible panic. The guy in my class saw my distress and asked me why I didn't call the police. In my mind, I felt that to be a really dumb question. Calling the police wouldn't have done much, or possibly nothing at all, considering the person following me was within arm's reach. If anything, any sudden movements during the time could have cost me my life. Like clockwork, the class was let out to go home for the night. I was still visibly shaking from the recent information, and by no means did I want to go back out there in the dark, waiting for my pursuer to potentially catch up to me. The guy saw that I was still shaken up, so he politely asked if I wanted to be escorted to my dorm, to which I immediately agreed. I admit, it was stupid to let some random guy escort me to my dorm, but if you were just as afraid as me that night, having an extra someone to talk to wasn't such a bad idea. The rest of the night was smooth and not stressful at all. Surprisingly, we talked the whole way, and I didn't get any suspicions of being followed. We made it to my dorm hall, and I thanked him for being so nice to show me to my dorm. From there, that was the end of it. Later on, that random guy in class became my husband of 2 years now. I'm thankful to have had him there to soothe me through that frightening experience. Though to this day the experience still sends chills down my spine, just from thinking of it. Makes me wonder what would have happened if I didn't trust my instincts that night, or what would have happened if the person following me actually decided to interact with me. What were their intentions? Were they hostile intentions? I will never know or find out for the rest of my life, and frankly, I want to keep it that way. So, this story is from a friend of mine, but I have his permission to share it. He has told it on multiple occasions, and I swear, it's one of the scariest stories I've ever heard in my life. It doesn't involve Bigfoot or ghosts or anything like that. It's a story of how reality can be way, way scarier than anything like that. For the longest time, he's worked as a trail ranger at a large national park. A trail ranger is basically a ranger, only with considerably less judicial power. He can't arrest you or anything, but if you're in an illegal bind or hunting stand, he had the power to call in actual cops before ripping down whatever unlicensed hide you've constructed. So this one time, he's accompanying an actual forest ranger and taking down unauthorized hunting cameras and feeders. The actual ranger was an older guy who started to feel unwell towards the early afternoon, so he headed back on his own. It was like an hour's ride on an ATV, and left my buddy to finish up. Just as he was almost done, my friend starts to hear voices coming through the trees. It's important to keep in mind that he was way off the beaten path at this point, so it's not like he expected there to be anyone around. But it occurs to him that these might be the people putting up the illegal cameras and blinds in the first place. He calls out to them, demanding to know who they are, but the voices just go quiet, and there's not a sound to be heard other than the occasional bird song. It's also starting to get dark by that time, so he starts heading back towards the trail where his ATV is parked. When he finds it and tries to start it up, it won't budge. That's when he noticed that the ATV battery has been torn out and taken by someone. Not some prank by the older ranger. Someone has actually disabled his means of escape. This obviously made him extremely nervous, especially since he's already heard voices in the area. He radios back into the ranger station that he's based at, basically telling them that he needed someone to come pick him up. They reply they'll have someone out there within an hour, but when he asks about the older ranger, they tell him he hasn't arrived back yet. Again, this made him really nervous, since the ranger should have easily arrived back by that point. He settled down and started a small fire as the sun went down, but before long, he heard those same voices again. They are not happy at all. He said it sounded like they were in the middle of a vicious argument, with one guy angry and yelling, while the other sounded frightened and apologetic. He listens for a minute or two before calling out into the darkness, asking if anyone needed help. The way he tells it, they must have heard him. He could hear them, so they must have heard him in return. But they didn't react, like they were too absorbed with their disagreement to answer him. My friend then radios back into the ranger station for a progress report. They replied, saying that they were having a little trouble finding the trail he was on, but that they wouldn't be much longer. The older ranger, however, still hadn't arrived back at the station. About 5 or 10 more minutes go by when my trail ranger friend begins to hear the same angry voices start up again. He decides to walk towards them, hoping maybe he can prevent a potential assault and maybe even get his hands on some food and water. He walked in their direction, but the voices seemed to be getting further away, no matter how much he tried to close in on them. Finally, after like 20 minutes of walking, he gave up and hiked back to his fire. It's about then that he got a radio call that they said the older ranger guy had been found, passed out, covered in vomit, having fallen off his ATV. He was being taken to the hospital, and that had taken priority over finding my friend. I mean, that's understandable, but my friend is getting kind of frustrated at this point. He's out in the woods on his own, and it's getting really cold. Then the voices came back. He's pretty bored at this point, and he's convinced that these guys don't want any company. So he said he just sat there in the darkness, listening to them argue over something. He's picking up little phrases here and there, when the voices begin to shout things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take," or, "It's mine, damn it." Stuff like that. He says he assumed it was two hunters, maybe arguing over a kill, but there was a good chance that they were blaming each other for the missing equipment that my friend and the ranger had confiscated. He heard the argument get louder as one of the hunters shouted something unintelligible. Then, out of nowhere, bang! A single gunshot echoes through the woods. He immediately doused his fire, ran a couple 100 meters into the trees, and then hid in a thicket. He said he waited there for as long as he could stand it, hearing absolutely nothing but his own heavy breathing, until he saw the lights of an ATV. He told the guy picking him up everything that had happened, and they called it into the ranger station. They had people looking for 3 hours out there, but not a single thing was found by any of the rangers. They came back the next day with state police and tracker dogs. It only took about an hour before a shallow grave was found. In it was a long dead corpse of a man who had clearly been shot in the forehead. The thing was, it was a skeleton that had been there for years and years. So either the argument he heard just ended with a bang and both parties went home last night, or he heard the murder of someone from years ago. I don't really believe the last part, and to be honest, neither does he. But it certainly makes for a creepy ending to the story. But the really scary part for me is that there's every chance that the gunshot he heard that night was yet another murder, and that the body will be found in a similar way by some unwary ranger, like some horrible time loop that'll never end. Just out of college, and despite having a degree, it was almost impossible for me to get a job. Day after day, week after week, I sent out my resume to every game developer and computer company in the country, and a few in Europe and Asia. 6 months into this, my money was running very low. This was when I was forced to face the facts. I needed a job immediately, and it didn't matter where and for how much. Just in time, I found a job listing for a video game store at the mall. You know the one I mean, and the terrible stories you hear about them are almost all true. Because of my background in games, I was given an interview immediately and hired soon after. My first shift was the following morning. Other than a few hiccups along the way, it kept my head above water until I got with Dell 2 years later. The meat of the facts began just before my second year was about to start. Because of the high turnover, I was made an assistant manager by month 9. Most of my shifts were evening, so I was tasked with keeping the younger employers in line. A job I never really took seriously since I was only a few years older than they were. I didn't give a crap how they acted, as long as they did their job. Around this time, a girl was hired that could have been my undoing. The second I saw her, I knew she would be a problem. However, it wasn't just her that was the source of trouble. Her super jealous boyfriend became a thorn in the side of every guy that worked with her, and sometimes just spoke to her. A shift of hers didn't go by without him showing up to check on her. Some nights, he would do no more than sit on the bench outside the store and watch her work. But anytime she would get too close to a guy for his liking, he would approach them and physically intimidate the guy she was talking to. She never said a thing when this happened. I actually think she kind of liked it, but it would be what would push her away from him in the end. She had worked at the store for a couple of weeks before someone showed her the hallways that ran along the back of every place. She took advantage of the fact that he wasn't aware of them, and this turned out to be a big mistake. If any person listening to this doesn't know what I'm talking about, pay attention. You're about to learn something. I'm not sure how common this is, but some indoor malls, those built in the old way, where each store inhabited an area they leased from the mall owner, there are a network of paths, or halls, that run behind each business. They're used mainly by the employees. The system allows them to enter and leave their jobs without being seen by the customers. Although, I'm pretty sure their intended purpose was to give janitorial staff an uncluttered pathway to maintain the spaces. That being said, in all my time at that job, I only saw a member of the cleaning staff a handful of times. Most of those times, they were sneaking a cigarette rather than working. Luckily, we could still smoke inside the building back then. No one said anything to the office if they caught you. Probably because they were doing the same thing on their breaks. If we are all on the same page now, I'll get to the real story. Like I said, his jealousy, no matter how it turned her on, was at the same time pushing her away. On her breaks, she'd often sneak out the back and disappear for a while. Where she went, I had no idea, or really cared. The boyfriend took forever to catch on, but when he did, he was super pissed. She continued this routine for a few months, and just one day, she never came back to the store. I didn't attach any importance to this. It was during the holidays and work was a nightmare. It wasn't uncommon for employees to go on a break after an especially hectic rush and not return. The turnover was simply that bad. Things got a bit more interesting about 4 or 5 days later. The police showed up and had some questions about her disappearance. I was like, disappearance? What's going on? Then they informed me that she had been reported missing the day after she bailed on work by her parents. She had never made it home, and they thought that we might know something. The crazy thing was that when they visited her boyfriend's place to see if she was there, in addition to him not being there, after some digging, they learned that nobody had seen either of them for about a week. I was quick to make it clear that I didn't know crap. I had just assumed that she got sick of the place and bailed. I guess they were happy with that. I never heard from them again. Time passed, and the situation around her almost faded completely from my mind, until something really big in February happened and brought it back into crystal clarity. Some workmen were renovating one of the store spaces for an incoming client, and once they had completed emptying the space of what the previous renters had left behind, they began the undertaking of finding the source of a terrible smell. Initially, it had been inferred that the smell was emitting from some old food products left behind in the space, but even after clearing, the stink remained. The next theory was that an animal like a rat had died in the wall. It had happened before. So, before they went to the extreme of busting holes in the wall to find the source of the smell, they went next door to the adjoining space that was also empty and had been for some time. They spent close to an hour sifting through the tons of old displays and leftover building materials. It turned out that the mall had been using this space for years as storage, and the place was a mess. The two guys tasked with doing this were about to say forget it, when one of them stumbled upon the source of the stink, and it definitely wasn't a rat. Someone had taken a large piece of plywood and put it over a tiny little closet, thus making it invisible. The guy had caught on that the smell grew worse as he got closer to this board. So, he pushed it aside, the heavy display rack holding the board against the wall, and as soon as he pulled back the board, he found what was causing it. The semi-mummified body of what looked like a female was laying on the floor facing the wall. It appeared that the arid and dry Arizona heat had preserved the corpse and suppressed decomposition. This had to have been why it wasn't stinking up the entire mall and managed to remain hidden for so long. Naturally, the mall was alive with talk of who the body could possibly belong to. Numbers of people had just stopped coming to work one day or skipped out during their lunch. Hell, we had gone through at least 15 people in the last year ourselves. When the answer came, no one could have guessed who it was. Early one morning, I was awakened by my manager with the news that Becky Morrison was the person they found dead in the empty store. My only answer was, "Who?" He reminded me that she was the girl with the crazy jealous boyfriend that had disappeared just before Christmas. I hung up and went back to sleep. When I returned for my shift that night, it was the only thing anyone could talk about. The next question asked was, who had killed her? The overall favorite was the crazy boyfriend. Everyone knew by now that he had disappeared just after her, and considering his body wasn't found alongside hers, it was a fair assumption. He was most definitely nuts. It made sense. The story took on a whole new angle just a couple of weeks after she was identified. An article was published in the paper discussing a possible new motive behind the murder. The police had recently received information that Becky had been messing around with a fellow mall employee during her breaks. They were meeting in the unoccupied store her body had been discovered in and having sex. After following some leads, they were able to identify the employee. He was a 22-year-old guy working in the Hallmark store, but no name was given. He told the officers that he and Becky were supposed to hook up the day she disappeared, but he got held up, and by the time he had reached the empty space, she was gone. He figured she couldn't wait and returned to work. It was only a few days later, when the cops showed up at the mall to ask questions, that he heard she was missing. His mind went straight to murder, and he was afraid he would be blamed for it, so he said nothing. Then, when the news reached him that her boyfriend was also missing, it was too late. He figured if the boyfriend was hiding out, waiting for his chance to kill the guy she had been banging, it was best for him to say nothing, just on the off chance he didn't know for sure who the guy was. It all boiled down to him being afraid, and with what I knew, I could understand. What nobody knew and still probably doesn't, is that her and I had a thing for a short while too. It wasn't long, but once is all it takes. I was the person who told her about the back hallways after all. We slipped out there a few times to mess around. Fortunately, we never got busted. When she moved on to the next guy, I wasn't hurt. I knew she had a boyfriend anyway. Now you know why I had to act as if I didn't care about her. We figured it was the safest thing for the both of us. Turns out we were right. I was overjoyed that no one knew about us. If dude was crazy enough to strangle her for cheating, which seemed to be the reason, he would no doubt come after the dude she was banging. I felt sorry for the Hallmark guy. It wouldn't take much mental math to figure out who he was, if he didn't already know. And since they still haven't found him, to this day, the fear of her boyfriend popping up out of nowhere and putting some holes in him must have been real strong. I know I was looking over my shoulder for several years after. The police have this theory that he had committed suicide not long after the murder. There hadn't been any activity on his bank account or cards for years, but I still wasn't taking any chances. 9 years later, a week doesn't go by that I don't think about her. An outsider may have seen her as an easy girl, but I still don't think of her that way. It struck me that she was just looking for a guy that would treat her well and commit to her for the long term, without being psychotic about it. She was a genuinely good person, and certainly didn't deserve the end that she got. But then again, I can't think of very many that do. This all happened the night before I moved onto the campus dorms of my local university. I was living with my mom and dad at the time, and I was excited for the freedom that awaited me. So naturally, being an insomniac, I couldn't sleep, and I decided to go on one of my nightly walks. I lived about 3/4 of a mile from a gas station, so I figured I'd go get a soda. It was around 3 in the morning when I snuck out of my parents' house. Everything seemed relatively calm, and I enjoyed my walk. This all ended when I walked past a house with a running car in the driveway. This set off some red flags, because I live in a town with a lot of drug-related crimes, and the whole situation looked really seedy. One of the men looked at me, and it made me really uncomfortable. So I picked up my pace and made my way to the gas station. The gas station was closed, which made me really upset because Google said they were open 24 hours. So I posted a mini rant on Snapchat, and I made my way back home. The gas station scenario made me forget about the shady car situation, and I just walked right past it. Then a chill went down my spine as I saw the glow of headlights coming from behind me. My heart dropped, and I had a powerful sensation of dread. The car followed me very slowly for 20 seconds. Then, my flight instincts kicked in, and I ran. This hasn't been the first time I've been followed by a car, and my paranoia went into overdrive. I ran so fast I'm convinced that I could have won medals for it. I ran through a church parking lot and hid behind a building. It was a large Catholic complex that doubled as an elementary school. So a large church and several mobile home buildings lined the property. I hid behind one of the mobile homes and heard a man get out of the car and call out. He eventually got in the car and rounded the street corner so he could see the other side of the complex. Since I would be visible to him, I snuck around so I was in between two mobile buildings. I was in a position where I could see the glow of his headlights on the street. For 10 minutes I waited for him to leave. He repeated the process of calling out and looking for me. I looked out again and saw that the headlights were gone, so I figured it was safe to leave and make my way back home. As I was walking down the road, the glow of the headlights came back on, and within a minute, the car was next to me. I kept thinking to myself, I'm dead, I'm dead, I'm dead. The man rolled down his window and asked if I needed a ride. I told him no, since I don't live that far away. He kept asking if I needed a ride, and I kept declining. Eventually he said good night, but proceeded to follow me slowly. So I just walked up to a random house and pretended it was my house. Thankfully, he resumed a normal driving pace and was gone fairly quickly. I left the yard and made my way home. It's been a year now since that happened, and I still get jumpy when a car passes me while I'm walking. I don't go on nightly walks as much as I used to, and when I do, I'm constantly on edge. I don't want to know what that man had in store for me if I had taken his offer for a ride home. This is a story of something that my dad witnessed unfold when he was a kid in northern Texas. He was born and grew up on his family's farm until he was drafted to fight in Vietnam. In that neck of the woods, most of your neighbors' farms may be over 5 miles away. But the neighborly spirit of helpfulness meant all one had to do was ask, and assistance would be given, without a second thought. There was an exception to that rule, however. The two landowners located to the north of his family's place had been at war since, some said, the Civil War. One farmer had been a loyal Democrat and slave owner, while the other was supposedly the head of a recently arrived Yankee family who was a supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the newly formed Republican Party. The Yankees were also wealthy and had purchased a large plot of land that the other farmer had his eyes on for some time. Like so many other families at that time and in that part of Texas, what started off as a disagreement over politics, the coming war would only serve to worsen. Upon the end of that bloody conflict, and with the return of both men from fighting in it, those in surrounding area hoped the differences between them would be squashed. But this was not to be. The bitterness that had always been there, seething just below the surface, would break free anew after a dispute over a property line sprang up. Josiah Campbell, the patriarch of the pro-Union Campbell clan, had purchased a 500-acre piece of land just before the war had broken out. This large parcel adjoined to his neighbor to the east, Samuel Johnson's property. But it wasn't until 1883, when Campbell began to put in fencing to keep his neighbor's cattle from encroaching onto his land, did the already hostile relationship between the two landowners reach a new and dangerous boiling point. Multiple face-to-face confrontations would ultimately lead to a court battle in which Campbell would come out the victor. If Campbell believed the court's judgment would be the end of the argument between the two families, he would be proven terribly wrong. Many more disagreements, some of them over insignificant things, would arise in the following generations. One of the more notable involved Josiah, now a grandfather, in which a stray bullet would come very close to striking him. Although most in the area assumed Samuel or one of his sons fired the bullet, it could never be proven. Incidents similar to this would only serve to keep the bad blood between the families just hot enough. My family's part in this drama is small. Financially and politically, our lot was similar to that of Johnson's. A native Southern family arriving in Texas during the Republican period from Tennessee. However, that's where the similarities ended. From what has been passed down through generations, Samuel Johnson and most of his offspring were ignorant and always looking for a fight. One specific story claims that my great-great-grandfather even stopped attending church because of them. Their attempt at avoiding any involvement in the whole mess was well fought, at least until a quiet morning in 1962, when they would be pulled into it, whether they liked it or not. It was a warm June morning. My dad and his family went to church like usual. Everything was normal that day, except for the conspicuous absence of the Campbell family. The section they had been sitting in since the building of the church was glaringly empty. Because of this, mutterings quickly began to spread through the congregation. The Johnsons sat quietly in their own section, doing their best to ignore the rumblings around them. The Reverend waited, but was eventually forced to go on with the service. On the drive home, the family passed the Campbell place, expecting to see the bustle of the daily work and those involved in doing it. However, not a soul was seen, and the house sat still, showing no life within. My grandfather dropped the women off at the house, and he and my dad returned to the Campbell place to take a closer look around. As they approached the home, the uncomfortable silence was broken by the slamming of a screen door. It had been left open and free to swing in the wind. The noise brought out the livestock, and their incessant mooing showed that they had yet to be fed or milked. If this was truly the case, something had to be very wrong inside. My dad ran into the barn and fed them quickly and rejoined his dad at the door. They were able to enter with no problems. Unlocked doors were still a common practice in those parts, but that would soon change. There were no signs of life in the back part of the house. My grandfather called out but received no answer. If anyone was still alive inside, the creaking of the stairs as they climbed them certainly would have caused them to stir. But no one appeared. The two men separated as they reached the landing, each heading for different closed doors. Just by chance, my father was the first to discover the fate of the Campbell clan. Two small bodies laid still. In their little blood-soaked beds, John Jr. and William had been shot repeatedly as they slept. Upon taking in the sight, my dad rushed from the room, battling the urge to throw up. He was still just barely out of childhood himself, and yet to have witnessed something so horrible. His father was just about to enter the bedroom of the Campbell parents when his son came rushing from the room. Although no words were exchanged between the two, my grandfather knew what horrors the room behind him likely held. The scene in the parents' room was much like that of the children. Both elder Campbells laid motionless and bloody in their large Victorian bed. They had been shot with a shotgun to the head, but John Sr., the patriarch, had been shot several more times. So much so, it was impossible to definitively identify him. Despite this, there was no doubt the heinously slaughtered man was indeed John Campbell, and the man behind the shotgun was his lifelong adversary, Matthew Johnson. The ill-tempered Matthew's absence from the morning services was almost as noticeable as that of the Campbells. The manhunt that followed didn't last long. Matthew's body was found hanging in the loft of the barn, and the death was ruled as suicide. The motive behind the terrible act, more than likely, was the latest in their long string of court battles. This time, The Campbells found it necessary to bring Matthew into another expensive and drawn-out case over the water rights along the long disputed property line the two families shared. After more than 3 years of fighting, the Johnsons would ultimately come up on the short end of the stick. What would have been just another link in the chain that had connected the two farm dynasties for over 100 years proved to be the end of the Johnson family's hold on their land. It was later discovered that they had been barely managing to keep their heads above water, from harvest to harvest, and John Campbell's suit and their eventual loss was the final blow. Once Matthew no longer had anything left to lose, the century-old bitterness between the neighboring families broke free and gave him the justification many of those before him lacked. His wife told the sheriff all she claimed she knew. Her husband had stepped out just after sundown, only to return 2 hours later with a substantial bit of blood on his shirt. She stood by their bedroom window and watched as he burned those same clothes. After he finished this, he came to bed and went to sleep like normal. However, the next morning when she awoke, Matthew was not in the bed next to her. She searched the farm, but he was nowhere to be found. The family went to church like normal because she feared their absence would cause people to talk. She swore she had no idea what her husband was going to do when he left that evening, or what he had done when he returned. It was clear that he had done something dark, but his target wasn't known. The remaining members of the Johnson family had an auction for their few valuables and vacated the property soon after. Dad said that they were rumored to be living in Wichita Falls, and Matthew's wife had remarried. But once he went off to the war, he never heard anything else about them. The ownership of their former homestead and adjoining land was purchased by a big land company out of Fort Worth, who broke the land up into smaller parcels and sold it off to new buyers. As for the Campbell land, the place would sit empty for many years. The slaughter that took place inside, tainting the value of an otherwise beautiful home. That land, too, would invariably be broken up and become a massive housing subdivision when the area and all the remaining family farms were consumed by the nearby city.
This happened to me on summer break in the middle of high school. I was hanging out with my best friend, staying up all night, but his mom kicked us out of the house because I wasn't allowed to sleep over. So this seemed like a normal night. We went to my house and messed around on my 360 until my dad kicked us out because he had to work and didn't want to get woken up. We walked around everywhere. The sun is fully set. We're messing around talking about random stuff, shooting the shit, when he says, "Let's go walk over to City Hall." We were walking there when we noticed it was unusually empty and quiet. Now this is the middle of Rhode Island, and everyone's out and about until 2 a.m. So we thought this was strange, but we ignored it. We took stupid pictures with his iPod Touch and my NV3. Then we decided to start heading towards his house using the main road because we were sure it was the quickest way and the safest route. We walked past my street, and then noticed that there's still no cars on the road. It was only 12 a.m. at this point. I pointed it out to him, but he just dismissed it. Now this main road to his house was maybe 1 mile, so it should have only taken 20 to 30 minutes to walk at our not-so-fast pace. Midway through the road was a gas station, and only 2 blocks down from my street, I stopped us and told him, "Do you hear that?" The sound was light static, like a radio and TV combined, but very muffled and quiet. We looked down the street, and at that gas station was a person. Now we just thought that it was a homeless person, and from the way homeless people are in downtown Providence act like these hours, we didn't want to go near him, so we crossed the street. But so did he. At this point, He was stumbling, mimicking us across the street without skipping a beat. My friend notices this, and he freaks out going, "Look! Do you see what he's doing? He's got to be on drugs or drunk or something," in a loud whisper. I started getting chills running down my back because I had realized he was mimicking me. It was like I was puppeteering his legs, but the rest of him was completely out of it, swaying, leaning backwards with his arms flopped out. I became petrified when he started walking by the light post, and I realized that I could not see anything of detail on him. No clothes, no face, just a black shape of a person. He was still walking towards us as I tried to shake off the copied movements. I started running back and forth on the street all at once, pointing and looked. He looked basically sliding across the street like a glitched video game character. He then got within 2 blocks of us. My friend and I instantly had got that horrific feeling because we both looked at each other and said, "We need to run. There's something wrong here," more or less. And on the count of 3, we sprinted off the main road down the block only to stop at the 4-way intersection. We were under a street lamp and we just looked down the street to make sure he kept walking. All of a sudden, he stopped at the corner of the main road, and we were asking each other, "What the hell is he doing?" when he burst into a full sprint towards us. We didn't skip a beat and turned in our track runners, running towards my friend's house on the side roads. We got a block and a half away and looked back only to see the black figure walking away in the direction he was chasing us, disappearing out of view. It looked like a black outline of a zombie in all honesty. We sprinted to the main road and kept walking, nervously talking about what had just happened. Everything turned out normal when a car passed by, but then went dead silent again. We noticed that not even the police were parked where they usually sit during these hours, but we kept walking. Now, before his street, there is a highway that separates the neighborhood, and to the right of that, before the bridge, is a small building for getting your alternative high school degree. We were walking past that, suddenly hearing what sounded like extreme static, like the sound from Back to the Future when the DeLorean time travels, only ear-piercing. The entire sky lit up blue, then faded to black. Time seemed to slow down for a few seconds and then return to normal with the sky. We then realized that the sun was coming up, which was the most incredibly bizarre thing ever. It had just been 12:27 when I looked at my phone, and it was suddenly 6 a.m. We stood on the bridge, noticing everything returned back to normal, talking about what had happened. I refused to walk back home, and crashed at his house until I walked to my house with his girlfriend at the same time because her and I got kicked out again for not telling his mom. The entire thing has me completely confused 9 years later, as it did the same day it happened. I remember when I got home, I slept nearly 26 hours and I woke up with my mom asking me if I was feeling sick. To this day, I have no idea what happened. This story happened when I was 12 years old. I'm a female and 25. The story I'm about to tell you might not be scary to most, but for me and my parents, it was. I remember it. It was a Saturday night, around 9 or 10 p.m. during summertime. I owned one dog at the time. His name is Benny. My parents decided that night that they felt like going on a walk around the block walking Benny, and they asked me whether I wanted to join them. I said no, because I wanted to play PWI on PC, Perfect World International. My parents were okay with leaving me since the walk wouldn't take more than 30 minutes tops. As my parents would get dressed to leave the house, I logged in PWI and looked around in my guild and global chat to see if anybody was on. For some reason, no one was, so I decided to join my parents. I got dressed, I put Benny on his leash, and we left. I'd like to mention I lived in the apartment building that had 10 floors, and we lived on the very first floor. I'm not sure how to explain, but you have the basement of the building and then the first row of apartments. Basically, you enter the building and already you're facing apartments. I lived in the very first one. I remember always hating that because whoever would pass by our door, we would hear them at any time during the day or night. Whoever was lurking at night, we would hear them. It was somewhat eerie to live on floor 0. Anyways, we leave the house. My dad closes the door. We had 3 keyholes and a steel bar that would block the door from the inside. The bar covered half of the door. Precautions were my father's obsession. We exit the building and enjoy our walk. After 15 minutes, we realize the wind has changed from warm summer wind to incoming storm wind. My mom makes the call to go back home as Benny already did his duties, so we all return. We open the building door, climb the 5 stairs to our door and attempt to open it. And my father does the following. Unlocks the first 3 locks, and then attempts to unlock the metal bar that holds the door locked. At that moment, my father pauses, turns around at us with the most serious face I have ever seen him, and whispers to us to call the police and ring the neighbor's door, who I will call Ted, comes out asking my father what happened. My father whispers to him, covering the see-through hole of the door. Someone is in our house. He or they are holding the door. Please stay here with my family and attempt to open it. I will be back. After saying that, I see my father rush all by himself around the building in the dark. I say dark because we didn't have a streetlight on the side of the apartment facing the block garden. My dad disappears into the darkness. I go outside too, not following him too much, but only to hear if he's in trouble. He's my dad, don't judge me. As soon as I get out, I hear him shout, "Hey, you! Come back! Who the hell do you think you are? I called the police!" At the same time I hear him shout, I look at Ted, who manages to open the door and enter the house. I go after them and enter my house. It no longer felt like my house. In just 15 minutes while we were walking, the home invaders made a complete mess of our house. All our shelves and wardrobes were pulled out, our clothes scattered all over the house. Benny's dry food was all over the floor, indicating that they must have tripped on his bowls, probably not knowing we owned a dog. But what scared me the most was how organized they were. I say this because, after seeing the disaster they had left behind, we knew it was impossible for just one person to hold the door, steal and organize what they want, and to take them. I say organized because the thieves put in our living room, all packed and ready, and they wanted our laptops, one of our TVs, my father's collection of coins, our phones, chargers, wallets, and even my father's camera. He's a photographer, and that week he had to attend a wedding. They didn't have enough time to steal all of that, so they just settled with some of my mom's jewelry and some pocket money. After seeing this, in my silly child mind, I rushed to my mom to check the piggy bank. I always saved my money from whatever chores I did. It wasn't much, but it was my work and my savings at the time. I thought they stole it too. When I entered my room, I see the metal bars covering my windows are cut open and my window broken. This is how they entered. Through my room. My room is the only room facing the side of the building and the one most secluded from views. Needless to say, I never felt safe in my own room, in which I had lived in for the next 10 years of my life until I moved in with my fiancé. The police arrives, and they start throwing white dust. I have no idea what it is still, all over our house to find fingerprints. They take pictures, take our statements, analyze my room and window. They were unable to catch the home invaders, but were able to tell us that this invasion was not the only one in our neighborhood. During that month, another 4 houses were broken into, one of them being the home of a cop, not related to the cops at the home. They told us that the invaders analyzed their victims, learned their schedules, even knew where the children's room were as they seemed to be entering the houses through the children's windows. All the families affected by them had children. They did not expect us to go back that soon and panicked. Hence, one of them was holding the door with his body so the others could flee. The person after which my dad was shouting was probably the one holding the door and escaping last through my broken window. I don't know what could have happened if I didn't change my mind and give up on raiding for gears and PWI. I would probably have came face to face with these invaders. I am happy I didn't, and I hope to God that I never meet them, period. This happened to me 2 to 3 years ago. I was around 23 at the time. I am a female and I live in Romania. One night, I was coming home from class. It's a master's class that started at 6 and ended at 10 p.m. I had to take the subway for about 12 stops. The destination I had to get off was at the end of the line from the subway. At that time, there wouldn't be many people in the subway. I'm a pretty lonely person. All I need is my headset and my music, and I am good to go. Said be done, I plug in my music and pick the furthest chair in the subway, away from the other 2 people that were taking the subway with me at the time. So far, so good. Until I see within the corner of my eye a silhouette approaching me and sitting right next to me. It was a man, fairly built, dark hair, wearing glasses, a black shirt with a black hoodie with a sickening smile. He doesn't engage in talking with me, but would just stare at my phone as I would browse through my music. I could hear him breathe heavily. Not like painfully, but still, he was just feeling something very strong. I felt uneasy, so I decided to change my seat and go even further behind, trying to avoid him without looking like a freak to myself. I don't know to whom. There was just one other person with us the whole day, so I guess that scared me even more. I picked a new chair, sat down, plugged in my headset again, and proceeded with my remaining 2 out of 12 stops on my way home. I see the silhouette growing bigger and bigger and a breeze running on my skin as I realize the guy is again sitting right next to me, glancing mid-air, dead eyes, a big smile staring right into my phone. I panic. There are still 4 stops to go. I have nowhere to hide. I look after to the other person in the subway trying to sit next to her, thinking that strength comes in numbers. She's no longer there. I start shaking a bit, but not allowing the creeper to notice me being vulnerable. I stand up, go to the door, and just decide to stand until my stop comes. This way, he won't sit next to me, right? Wrong. He comes straight after me, sits on the chair right next to the door, and because he couldn't see my phone, on which he was so focused so far from that angle, he fixates right me in his soul with his black dead eyes and says, "Hi, gorgeous. Why are you avoiding me?" I am freaking out as I'm looking on my phone trying to call my boyfriend or message him, and he stops me by saying, "I know no one will help you. You would have sent that SOS message by now, and I know you didn't." That moment, I realized I am cornered. He has been focusing on my phone to see who I was talking to, trying to figure out if I panic, trying to see if I would ask somebody for help. He cornered me bad. I had the luck to reach my stop, and I would delay any reaction or ignore him so that he would repeat whatever he wanted to say. I dropped off and runned for the exit, not looking back. I get out to the surface and I don't see him anymore. At this point, I put my phone in my purse and realize I had pepper spray with me all along. My heartbeat becomes to a normal as I know at least I have something to defend myself with, but still a long way to get home, and who knows if he is alone or not. I walk rather fast for maybe 5 minutes from the metro and I feel a hand grabbing my wrist hard and pulling me back. Another hand covered my mouth, disabling me from screaming my lungs out. It was him. The same black hoodie, dark hair, and dead-eye stalker. He was furious and said,
Running from me? How dare you run away from me? You should be honored I gave you attention. I am fairly built for a woman, 80 kilograms and 1.75 meters tall. So I guess he thought men didn't find me beautiful or something, and should feel blessed that a creep like him stalks me and tries to hurt me. Now, my phone is in my bag, and I can't call the police. I can't reach for my pepper spray. I panicked. I can't punch him in the crotch. I can't scratch him as I don't have long nails. His hand is still on my mouth. What do? I did the most desperate and disgusting thing I could think of just to save my life. I played along. I used my other hand to touch the inside of his thigh and mumble a "I'm sorry" while his hand was on my mouth. He took his hand off of my mouth and I repeated that "I'm sorry." I didn't realize he was just flirting. He left his guard down and I took his hand off of my wrist. He asked me for my phone number and address to drop me off, but I refused, saying I'd rather add him on Facebook, and he agreed. I told him I was going to reach for my phone, but inside picked up my pepper spray and I got him all over his face, making sure I'd cover both eyes, nose, mouth, even his ears and hands. He instantly got all red, suffocating from the pepper and swelling. I called the police, then told them what had happened and what I did. They asked me if he was immobilized, and I said yes, as in the effects wears off in about 45 minutes. The police arrived nearly 5 minutes later to see me shaking like a leaf and a man on the ground swollen like a pumpkin, throwing up and swearing me between gasps of breath. He was then arrested, and the police told me they have been looking for him for the past 2 weeks as they discovered the body of a 24-year-old girl in his apartment. A fairly built lady, 1.77 meters tall, 75 kilograms with red hair. I had red hair too. The woman was his girlfriend, and ever since, he's never gotten back to the apartment. I do not know what he wanted to do to me. I could understand why he targeted me due to the similarities, but stranger in the subway stalking women at midnight trying to befriend them or even worse, murder them? I hope to God you and I never meet again. I remember when I was around the age of 4, my family and I moved into a small apartment on the 4th floor, which was pretty high. The apartment was full of stupid people like drug addicts and other low-life criminals. There were no other kids in the unit, so I mainly spent my time playing with toys. One night, after my mother turned off the lights for bedtime, the whole family went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night around 2 a.m. I was pretty thirsty, so I was going to go grab a cup of water from the kitchen. But as I was pulling off my blanket, I heard noises. Noises coming from the other side of the house. At the time, being a stupid toddler, I didn't think anything of it, so I got up and walked out of my room. The moon was lighting up the room through the open sliding door to the veranda. But then I came to the terrifying realization that the sliding door was supposed to be closed. I knew this because I was the one who closed it before bed. And at that moment, I heard those noises again, and they were coming from the kitchen. I put 2 and 2 together and realized that someone was in our home. I tried tiptoeing to my parents' room, but I looked behind me and what I saw scared me. It was a man in a costume. He looked at me and grabbed me. He was pulling my hair and putting his hands over my mouth, but I broke out of his grip and I ran to my mother's room. I was too scared to say anything. The next morning,
I told my mother everything, but she just told me that it was just some wild nightmare. I tried to tell my dad, but he said the same. Only I know what had happened, but nobody believes me. I will never forget that sack he wore over his head. And the thing that still bothers me is how did he manage to get to the 4th floor? The door was locked, and so were the windows. So did he climb the entire building? And if he did, why me? This is my true story.
Okay, so this all happened about 3 years ago, give or take. I was around 17 years old. I am not going to dramatize anything, but let me go ahead and say that I think, personally, that this is a pretty bizarre story. There are some details about my actual relationship I'm going to leave out. My ex-girlfriend Jane and I lived about an hour away from each other. We met at a park out of state and ended up living kind of close. We hit it off and dated a month after we met. Our entire relationship lasted a year, and she was my first girlfriend. From the very beginning of the relationship, she would discuss her best friend named Patrick. He was in his late 20s, and she, as a reminder, was 17, and worked in a bookstore. He lived in her town, and had known him since she was 13. From very early on, I thought the stories she would tell about him were outlandish. She would talk about watching him get into bar fights with a guy that went by the name Hammer. How once they pretended to rob a gas station but left money on the counter and had to jump off a roof to escape security, in which Patrick broke his ankle. On another occasion, Patrick got a brand new Mustang that they wanted to crash into a lake. So they jumped out of it at the last second. This tale she told me towards the end of our relationship, at which point I was completely skeptical of everything she said. You get the idea. The stories she said were clearly exaggerated or downright fake. Part of me thought she was just trying to impress me for whatever reason. Here are some other important facts that I don't really know where to put, so I'll put them here. Jane was an artist. She drew all the time, in her journal and on little notes. She rarely drew people, as they actually were anyway. She drew people as monsters or animals. For example, she always drew me as a giraffe. She was good at it. Patrick's last name, according to her, was pronounced and spelt a certain way. Willington. Patrick Willington. Patrick's dad owned a successful company out of state that Patrick would inherit. Jane had a much older brother, who was in his late 20s as well, that had joined the military and moved out to Korea. She only saw him every few years or so. Okay, back to the story. Jane would tell me that Patrick was very protective of her. She would tell him about me, and he would always be unsure of what he thought. She said he wanted to beat me up sometimes, and that he'd hurt me if I hurt her. If she told him about something silly I did, he'd think I was an idiot and call me stupid. He also thought I was gay. This is, of course, all second-hand information. Never once in the entire relationship do I think I spoke to him. I'd also like to remind everyone that this was my first relationship. I was very insecure, very confused, and there was more going on in that it complicated some things. I did not have the best rationality, as you may have deduced from how weird this sounds. The thing is, I really did have no reason not to believe her. She had no reason to lie about any of this, but I was still skeptical. Sometimes, Jane would go to Patrick's house really late at night. She said she'd sometimes sleep on his couch, and that he would literally throw her out of the house in the morning. Sometimes said she had to sneak out of her house to go to his. He lived within walking distance apparently. One time later in the relationship, Patrick invited her on an out-of-state trip back to his hometown. They were going to stay in a mountain cabin for a week. I was not happy about that. I was more upset when she said she wouldn't tell her parents and that they'd leave on a bus in the morning. Now, at this point in the relationship, I was very unsure of what exactly was going on with this Patrick person. But if Jane said that if I told her parents about the trip, that she would be unable to go, and that Patrick would hate me and she'd be pissed. It was important to her, because Patrick apparently would be forced to move away soon to work at his dad's company, and she said she'd never see him again, so she needed to go. Well, when the day came for her to leave, as I also discussed this with friends and family at the time, Patrick never showed up to get her or whatever. She was very upset, even though he'd be back in town one more time. Oh, another tidbit. Jane's parents never once mentioned Patrick. Ever. She never brought him up around either. The only time she mentioned Patrick to anyone else was to my dad, once, after we broke up. She told my dad one of the outlandish stories I mentioned. Why she met my dad after we broke up is for a different, unrelated reason. My dad was flabbergasted. Basically, I had told him about all of this, but hearing it in person was crazy. Patrick was supposed to have a birthday party once, before the mountain cabin trip thing happened. I was invited, and it was going to be at his house starting at midnight. I said I couldn't go to that, but that I'd get him a present. I got him some toolkit thing she said he'd like, and I gave it to her for him. She said she brought it, and that he did in fact like it. She said the party lasted until 6 a.m. Patrick sent me a text from her work phone once, when she was with him. It was standard behavior for him. He said I was a pansy or something, and that he would beat me up, and that was early on. I know things are getting out of order. I'm just trying to say them as I remember. Now here is where things get very interesting. Jane lived nearby an elementary school. She walked with me there and said his house was close. So she leads me to the back of the school where there is woodlands. She brings me to the edge of the woods and has me look in. I see a very old wooden tin house structure. It has broken windows, is filthy, and is falling apart. The path to it is covered by bushes and trees. She said that was the house. Oh, and at that point he had apparently moved out of state completely. I asked if she was joking, and she said no, and that he wasn't very tidy even when he did live there. I thought briefly that maybe the house was just funny looking on the outside, but actually good on the inside. But there was no way it was. It was abandoned. Anyway, that same day, she asked if I wanted to go inside. It was getting hot, getting dark, and no one knew exactly where we were, and I didn't want to get cut up by bushes or go into the sketchy house. So I said, politely, maybe another time. She insisted, saying that Patrick wanted us to check up on things, but eventually gave up, as this was close to the end of our relationship. I asked her a few more questions. You went through the bushes and stuff every time you went to see him? She said yes, but that they had overgrown since he left. I also asked about how he drove out of his house, how anyone else visited him, how he got his mail. She eventually realized that maybe I didn't exactly believe her and got angry. I said I was sorry and that it was just different to me, but she insisted it was all true. I let it go. Well, we ended up breaking up shortly after, but I had a hard time coping with the breakup and ended up speaking with her again later. She was on a bus with her class going on some trip. Well, I lost connection with her and called her back. A young man then answered. I asked who it was, and he said his name was Patrick Wilson, not Willington. So I opened up with a question about his last name, and also why he had her phone. He said that was always his last name, and said that he was on his office phone. I kept asking him questions about himself that only the real Patrick would know. I heard noises in the background. He would pause for a minute before answering. I think she just handed the phone to a classmate and told him what to say. Frankly, that's the only real answer to that. Well, he hung up and I called her back. Jane answered and said that Patrick told her I somehow got connected to his phone, since he was in her recent contacts or something. Clearly BS. But I played along, asking one more time about the last name, to which she said she had no idea what I was talking about, saying it was always Wilson, and left it at that. Oh, and he obviously wanted to beat me up, because I broke her heart. Well, I kept speaking to her for a week or two, and we both finally got closure about the whole thing. But I was recounting this experience with a friend, and realized something. Probably just a creepy coincidence. But I had saying Jane was an artist, and she always drew people as other things. Well, I saw many drawings of Patrick. She said he always wore this dark coat and ripped pants or something. She, as usual, didn't draw him as a human, she drew him as a skeleton. Really creeped me out for some reason. I tried using Google Earth to look at where his house was, since I remember exactly where she showed me. The trees are too thick to see in though, and there is construction nearby, so it may not even be accessible anymore. I've not gone back there in person since, as it's too far away, and also close to her house. I've Googled and researched countless Patricks in the way they were both said, and anything I could remember, to no useful results. She used to mention him on social media sometimes. A friend of mine who had trouble grasping all of this found her profile and saw him mentioned recently too. So I have a few theories. Patrick was just a sort of imaginary character that she made up to fill the place of her much older brother, who moved away when she didn't often see him. Her brother and Patrick were the same age after all, and kind of had similar personalities, as I did meet her brother once. Secondly, it may have all have been bullshit she made up for whatever reason, to impress me sometimes, to coerce me other times. The third is that it was part of a much greater disorder or problem, which is possible as Jane did have them. Or 4, Patrick did exist only in some way, shape or form, but she highly exaggerated him and rarely saw him. So she told me whatever she wanted about him, and it may not be creepy to all of you since you're outside my social circle. But like I said, that's why I'm sharing this. Because to me, personally, I was really bothered by this. Jane had a tendency to be a very violent and threatening person. Why did she make all of it up? Why did she show me that house and say it was his? What was in the house? Regardless of if anyone lived there. Did she ever actually go in? Like she said she did? Did she sleep there sometimes? Or visit late at night? If so, what in the world was she doing? Did someone really somehow live there? Why did she draw him as a skeleton? Why did he have such strong feelings about me? Why did she change his last name? Why did she do all these weird things with the phone and the classmate? How many of her other loved ones knew about this? And what would have happened if I'd have gone into that house with her? Some of this is probably my heightened anxiety, but I do think it's a weird story. Either way, it's a relief that we're broken up. I see a lot of people interested in the deep web these days. Mainly teens. People talking about red doors and maybe other alternative names to things that they think they're real, but have never seen themselves. People question this every day and ask, are these red door events real? Do they really happen? They are very real indeed. Unfortunately, people with sick minds who get off on torture and other abnormal things go searching for these red doors/red rooms, and when they find them, they dish out great amounts of money just to control the show. I'm going to tell you about the experience I had when I was going onto the deeper end of the web. Some of you may have heard it already, but you can't actually access it without Tor. Now Tor is infested with law enforcement. Red doors won't show up on the Onion any more than they used to. The only way that you can get to see a red door show is through the shadow web. And to get to the shadow web, you need an anonymous server which is called a Skix. It's like the new Tor, but without the law enforcement. The world is a much more cruel place nowadays in the cyber world. As a recently retired FBI agent who specialized in cyber crimes all around the world, I'm here to share a story of what I saw on one of my last cases before I retired. The case was never closed and got passed to the agent who replaced me. This was 4 months ago. I was working on a case that had been opened up through an anonymous complaint we had received online. The complaint was lengthy and in great detail described and mentioned many acts of torture beyond of what I had seen in my time in the agency. The tipster had sent screenshots of what they saw one night whilst digging deep onto the deep web. They explained how they had been a regular on the deep web, but that everything was dying out due to the LE that they wanted, so they needed to dig deeper, and they found the shadow web. The process of becoming a member of the shadow web was lengthy. The person claimed that it took them up to 2 weeks before they were granted access after paying. Finally though, the email they were expecting came in, and they were granted access after installing Skix. This was the new software that would allow them access to the shadow web servers. Little did they know what they were getting themselves into though. I can't give you too many details though, as the person who sent the information was murdered in their home a few weeks later. But this is where I will mention my experience as part of a personal investigation. I was given a link to the shadow web by the recently deceased, with permission from my boss. I was able to sit down and proceed and took the security precautions and paid the fee. It took the shadow web admin 2 days to send the email allowing me access. In the email, they prompted me to join as many as 4 live sessions that were going on throughout the week. One of them was called Sharkbait, another one was called Shit Cereal, and the other 2 are too gross to mention. The shadow web entrance that I was given was a portal to about 10 other websites through the shadow web. The websites didn't have names. They were named by numbers in a 1 to 10 list, and there were about 100 other websites on the bottom, but mainly they were all under construction. On the main page it showed the times, the dates, and the 4 shows that they were going to be broadcasting live on the shadow web through a stream. They were archives that began on March the 4th, 2015 and ended on August 23rd. These archives were of previous live streams that had already happened. I decided to take a look. The one that I chose was called Salted Snail. I didn't really know what to expect before clicking it. Judging by the name, I thought there had to be a snail involved. There wasn't. I clicked the link. It took me to a brown page with an advert and a video behind the ad. The advert started with a clown laughing. Then he says, "Not so fast. You'll have to go through me before you want to see what's to come." He reminded me of Captain Spaulding. He had several heads in the background, and his face was painted and smeared. His clothes were splattered with bloodstains. In the ad, he encouraged viewers to join one of the next sessions, to pay the fee, and to see the fun unfold, and that they were in full control of what happened to the sadistic victims. He then looked closely at the camera and said, "It's going to be one hell of a show." And the advert ended. The video was now available to play, and it was titled Salted Snail. It began with no credits. You see the clown again walking out from behind a white curtain that appeared to have either fecal matter or old blood smeared all over it, with a light behind. His face appears and is painted. He is naked and walks out of the curtain chuckling to himself and smiling. He then says the show is scheduled to stream for 15 minutes, so he has to stick to schedule because he is very, very hungry and has not eaten in the past 2 days. He then flashes his ribs at the camera. He wasn't that skinny, and then he asks everyone watching if they're ready for the show. He then chuckles and says, "I'll be right back." He goes behind the curtain and rolls out a black barrel and places it in front of the camera. He then walks around the barrel, knocking all around it with his fists as if he's knocking on a door, and then kicks it hard with his heel. You hear something in the barrel, and then he grabs what seems like a flat-headed screwdriver and pries open the barrel. You see a head full of hair as the lid opens. A girl sitting there alive. He then yells at her in Chinese to stand up. She can barely stand. Her body is so soggy, from what I assume is the effect of being in that barrel for days. He looks at the camera and says, "Doesn't she look delicious?" Delicious as cake. The girl had her hands tied up behind her mouth and was bound with multiple layers of cloth. She looked too weak to scream, too weak to escape or even attempt. She just stood there, for what seemed to be as if she were accepting her own death. Then the clown went behind the curtain and came back with a knife and a razor. He then got in front of the camera and said, "I love me Chinese food. It's dinner time." The girl then turned to him and looked at him as he nodded at her and said, "Oh yes, it's time." Her eyes opened wide. She tried to scream, but she couldn't. He then teased her, poking at her with a knife. She began to bleed instantly from the poking as she was extremely soggy. He then showed off the little razor blade and proceeded to cut little squares on her shoulder as if he were cutting a little piece of cake. Pretty soon, he was at the other shoulder, then her chest, breast and stomach. The scene was extremely gorish and violent, almost as if filleting a fish. By the time he was finished with the body, he had a plate filled with her skin and tissue. What seemed to be a plate full of soggy skin. But the girl was still alive. Her body looked like it had been eaten by piranhas. The only thing that remained were her breasts and her face and hair. Then he took the plate behind the curtain and brought back another plate. He then looks at the camera and says, "Well, look at that. Doesn't she look great? You can see that she may have lost a couple of pounds, huh?" He then winks at the camera and begins to laugh, and proceeds to slice off the girl's ears and lips. What looks now like a mutilated body that is still alive left me wondering what he had done to other people in the past. I was enraged and extremely disturbed by what I had seen. The finale showed the clown coming out of the curtain with 2 containers of salt. He then poured the salt off over her body where her skin had been cut off. He poured a good amount on her ears and lips too. The girl suffering, hardly moving, but still somewhat standing. He then looks at the camera and says, "I bet you thought I was going to kill her, didn't you? But I'm not a murderer." He then pushes her head back down into the barrel and closes the lid. He looks at the camera and says, "Stay tuned to the next episode." The camera then shows him putting a white tablecloth over the barrel and placing the plate full of soggy flesh on it. He lights a candle, grabs a knife and fork, and starts eating the flesh whilst chuckling away at himself. The screen then floods with the words, "Till the next episode," over and over, with some circus music playing in the back. The camera then dims, and it shows him there, eating and laughing away. The black screen shows the word, "Offline." I immediately became concerned for the girl. She was Asian. The clown clearly looked American, or sounded American at least. He really resembled Captain Spaulding from The Devil's Rejects or House of 1,000 Corpses. I am assuming that is what he was trying to act like anyway. I contacted my chief and had a personal meeting with him and explained everything that I had seen. He then laughed and said, "Oh, you've seen him too, eh? That clown on the internet. He's been around since the late 90s doing these shows. He seems to buy women off the black market and then torture the shit out of them." He then shrugs his shoulders and says, "We don't know who he is or where he's located. The Chinese help keep him anonymous, probably because he buys their stock." To me, this was something new. As an agent who dealt with homicides and piracy, I had never encountered nor seen anything like this. I am now retired, and I thought I would share this story with you. Everyone should know, the deep web is deep and free, but the shadow web, that is somewhere that you do not want to go to. Beware. I live by a small river, and my friend and I always spoke about putting a boat on it one night and just letting the current take us downstream whilst we fished all night. Well, a few years ago, we finally did it. We loaded up the boat with our fishing poles and a case of beer and headed out around 10 p.m. We put the boat in up the river, and my friend's girlfriend drove the truck home. The trip was only about 4 miles in a straight line, but throw in the curves of the river, and it was doubling back on itself. The actual trip was more like 15 miles. We'd been told it'd take about 6 hours, so we got to the river around midnight and expected to be home before 7 a.m. The river was really low that night, but we didn't expect it to be an issue, so we shoved off. The first few hours passed pretty normally, and we caught a few fish, but we passed a cutoff, and the river current just slowed to a halt. Around 2 a.m., we hear this faint groaning noise off in the distance. We didn't think much of it at first, because we are both campers, and we're used to the forest noises. As we keep moving slowly down the river, the groaning noises keep happening, and it's getting louder. I can't even really accurately describe the noise itself. It was a very throaty, groan/moaning sound, with a short duration. I say it was like a zombie noise, but it was very distinct, and at times it sounded like a man groaning in pain. For the next half hour, the noise got louder, until it felt like it was literally just out of sight on land, and it was loud. So I mentioned the river was really low. Well, at this point in our trip, the river walls were nearly vertical and 10 feet high. The sound is at its loudest right now, but as we go down the river, it doesn't get any quieter. We aren't moving past the groaning. It's following us in the darkness of the forest. We're both getting weirded out about it, and we're both assholes, and we're amplifying the situation by coming up with all kinds of scary things that it could be. It's a zombie, or a dying man trying to yell for help, a banshee, a ghost, or could it be a serial killer messing with us? Maybe it's a siren trying to lure us off course. As it nears 3 a.m, we're way behind schedule. To say I'm on edge is an understatement. I was trying to play it cool because my friend was playing it cool, and I didn't want him thinking that I'm a pussy. We're shining our flashlights into the forest, and we're watching as things scurry off in the darkness as the light hits it. The groaning is still going on. The loud groaning happens about once a minute, and something there is a quieter, slightly different sound that happens in between. The sound is finally behind us, but it wasn't getting much quieter. With the sound behind us, we figured we were in the clear, but we weren't so lucky. About 5 minutes later, we hit a log jam, and our only choice was to go ashore and carry the boat around the debris. There was one problem. We couldn't actually get out of the river. As mentioned, the river walls were 10 foot high, and our only choice was to go back up the river a couple of 100 feet to a low spot and carry it all the way around. Now, I was really dreading about getting out of the river. It's dangerous enough walking down the riverbanks in the pitch blackness, and I didn't need a zombie banshee serial killer making it worse. So we turn the boat around and head back towards the sound. We pull the boat out of the river and the sound just stops. This is it. It is definitely a serial killer taunting us. And now that we're out of the water, he's moving in for the kill. There is no more acting manly and unafraid. My friend knows I'm freaked out, and I'm sure that he is too. The boat is usually kind of heavy, but tonight it feels lighter than ever. We're practically jogging that thing down the muddy banks. Everywhere we look, we see what is ducking behind a tree and staying out of the light from our flashlights. We finally get past the log jam. We're putting the boat back in the river, and whatever is following us is right behind us. I'm in the boat, and my friend is getting in. He pushes us off out the river and runs around and yells into the darkness, "What do you want?" At this point, the Loch Ness Monster steps into the light and says, "I need about 350. Okay, that part didn't happen. But we get back on the boat in the river, and the noise has suddenly stopped. But we're both ready to go home. We run the motor until we get to a bridge. My friend calls his girlfriend and gets her to come pick us up 2 hours earlier than expected. She asks why we cut the trip short, and he makes up some bullshit excuse about the river being too shallow and blocked up with debris, because neither of us wanted to admit that we were grown-ass men being scared of the dark. I never told anyone else I know about this, and I don't think he has, but we still mimic the sound every now and then, and any strange noise is instantly referred to as a zombie banshee. A couple of years ago, I was sailing on a ship that maneuvered offshore with pipeline that ran to shore about half a mile off. As the ship was unhooking from the pipe, the line that was used to haul the pipe to the ship connection got wrapped around a person's leg and sucked him through the rails. He fell about 30 feet into freezing water, and the general alarm sounded for a man overboard, which woke me up at around 5. I woke up all confused to find everyone frantically running around on deck. Once I realized it was no drill, I ran to the starboard side, and there were around 3 life rings in the water, and one was around 3 feet from the guy, but he couldn't reach it. He had a work vest on that was keeping him afloat. Hypothermia had set in, and he was moving slow and was yelling for help. At this point it was clear he wasn't grabbing the life rings, so half the crew and I ran over to the rescue boat to unhook it, while the other half tried getting him on the ship. It seemed like it took forever to get the rescue boat down. The hold-down straps were rusted and took a bit to get off. The cover was still on the boat, and it was a bitch to get off. And the hoist is the slowest hoist, which seemed to take 10 minutes to finally get into the water. Finally, we get 2 guys in the rescue boat, in the water, and let the bow line off. And then the rescue boat engine cuts out. Luckily, it started right up again. At that point, I ran back to the starboard side, and everyone was yelling, "Where is he?" One of the mates said, "We had him on the ladder, but his leg is still caught in that line. We couldn't get it free, and he got sucked under the ship." At this point, everyone seemed to go silent. I looked down and saw the guy's boot float by. The next guy came to me and said, "He's gone." After a few nerve-wracking seconds, the crew in the rescue boat radioed that they found the guy bobbing in the water face down and still attached to the hoist line. He was unconscious and not breathing. At this point, the rescue crew tried pulling the guy on board, and with the swell of the sea and the way the boat hit his chest, made him spit up water and come to. The radio crew radioed back that he was conscious. The line was removed from his leg, and he was pulled fully onto the boat. The boat headed straight to shore where the beach crew and an ambulance were waiting. They were able to get the guy some coats and put them on him, and he was conscious enough to understand what was going on but not to speak. The ambulance took him, where he was sent to the ER for hypothermia and drowning. The guy's life vest saved his life in more ways than one. It kept him afloat and kept him visible. I say it kept him visible because if you blinked and he didn't have a life vest on, you would have never seen him again. Things luckily didn't result in a death, but easily could have, due to the temperature of water, visibility, equipment failure and reaction time. This is the scariest thing that has ever happened to me while sailing, and the look of terror on the guy's face is still with me, and the feeling of utter hopelessness to help, even though he was a mere few feet from the ship. He spent a few days in the hospital, and miraculously suffered no serious injuries, except near death. I was in Tesco, a generic wholesale shop that we have here in England, and just innocently browsing the DVD section on my own. I was looking at the new releases, but not paying too much attention. My friend's parents were always away on holiday, and she was having a sleepover. Girls' night at hers, and had asked me to get a scary horror film for us to watch. Whilst looking, I heard, "So you like movies, eh?" I turned around and saw this guy who looked to be around 70 years old. He had greasy hair, but what struck me the most is that he was wearing socks and sandals. Yeah, that kind of made me smirk. I looked at him and just said, "Yep," and proceeded to carry on down the aisle. He followed me and started talking about films that he'd seen, what I should get, etc. I just replied, "Yeah, okay, whatever," and was reaching the end of the aisle. I'm a girl, 23, but must have looked younger, as I didn't have that much makeup on, and I have dark brown long hair. This old guy was still following me, and asking me where I'm going, do I have a boyfriend, do I like oral, and if I am alone. That was it for me. I turned around, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "Piss off, you hillbilly pervert," and walked off into the shop. I had gotten some ice cream and some popcorn and was now in my car driving to my friend's, singing along, badly, to the radio. I'm not so sure how long it had been there, but I noticed a silver pickup taking the same turns as I was. I was only doing around 50 in a 70 area, and they could have easily have overtaken me if they'd wanted to, but it stayed right behind me. My friend's turning past me, but I could take the next turning and double back on myself through the back roads. I didn't indicate, something I regret now and realised that this was very stupid of myself. I took the turning and drove as fast as I could to her house. And as I did, I saw the car take the same turning as me. She lives in a cul-de-sac area, and I parked my car down the road, not in front of hers, and ran into her garden. She always keeps the gate open, and I didn't know how long it would be before she'd have to open the main door, so I chose the garden. I locked the gate behind me and knocked on the back door. After being let in and being called a weirdo and peeping Tom, I got handed some wine. Not a minute later, there was a knock on the door. My friend opened it. It was the creepy guy from Tesco, with his silver car in the middle of the road. He was standing there saying something along the lines of, his daughter's car had broken down, and she had rung up from a house along this street, and he's here to pick her up. Is she here? He described me and what I was wearing. My friend said no, and shut the door in his face and locked it. I hadn't told them about the creepy guy, I'd only just got there. But she said there was something off about him, and wasn't my dad. No way I would have ever have known him. We saw through the curtain that he went to every other house in the cul-de-sac. He would get turned away, and then move on to the next one. We later found a piece of paper in a plastic sandwich bag left on my car windshield. It said, "Where did you go? I wasn't finished with you." I met this guy at a party, and we hit it off instantly. I gave him my number before I left, and he texted me the next day to ask me out on a date for that evening. I complied. He took me out to a nice restaurant, and I was swooning, because not only did we have so much to talk about, but he paid for the bill, walked me home, and kissed me on the forehead when we parted ways. No red flags. I was absolutely smitten. Date number 2. Another restaurant. He paid for dinner again, walked me home, kissed me on the forehead and told me that I was beautiful. I leave. Still smitten. No red flags. We made a plan to go out on another date a few days later, but he ended up rolling his ankle the day before the date and was pretty much immobile. To remedy the situation, he asked if I'd like to go over to his place and watch a movie with him. I said, yes. I arrived and we talked for a bit. He had a cat and told me that his cat liked to hump this blanket, and that this blanket was basically his cat's girlfriend. I had a good laugh at that and thought nothing of it. We talked a bit more and then decided to watch the movie Fargo. Halfway through the movie, his cat entered the room and started to hump the blanket in the middle of the room. I immediately started to laugh. He had just told me about an hour earlier about the situation with the cat and his weird blanket girlfriend, and the cat showed up and started humping it. So it was funny. The guy turned to me with a completely deadpan expression on his face, and with 100% seriousness said, "Shh, he likes it quiet." What the hell? I stared at him blankly for a few seconds, desperately trying to pick out any sort of cue that this was a joke. It definitely wasn't. This guy was pissed at me for disturbing his cat in the throes of passion. I turned back towards the screen and spent the next 5 minutes conjuring up an excuse to get the hell out of there. I told him I had to leave because I had to work early and booked it out of his apartment. I didn't contact him again. There was radio silence on my end and a few texts from him. Whatever, it was over. I spent the next 2 weeks using it as a hilarious anecdote at social gatherings and replaying the "shh, he likes it quiet" over and over in my head, trying to reach some normal sort of explanation for it. A few days later, I threw a huge birthday party at a bar, and this guy shows up uninvited. I have no idea how he knew about the party, and was shocked to see him there. I exchanged pleasantries with him, and was trying to be really polite with the intention of asking him why he was there afterwards. Before I could ask, he tells me he made me a present, that it was a birthday card, that he made it in Photoshop, and that he needed to text it to me. I stood there awkwardly and full of dread as I watched him open his phone, find the photo, and send it to me. I cringed when I heard the ding on my phone and opened the text message apprehensively, and my heart sank. He made a collage photo of his cat, and the photo read, "Serial kitties, happy perf day." I told him he needed to leave, and I never saw him again.